Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ligia Duque Plateiro. I am the Education Program Associate at Chacruna Institute. I'm joining this conversation from Rio de Janeiro, and I would like to know where you are joining us from. So if you can, please share it in the chat. Today, we will have a very interesting conversation about the topic MDMA-Assisted Therapy, Timelines and Controversies. Our speakers include Jamie Beachy PhD, MDiv, a professional chaplain and ethics consultant involved in MAPS Phase 3 clinical trials, Ingmar Gorman, PhD, CEO of Fluence, a leader in psychedelic education, and Scott Shannon, who works at Wholeness Center, a comprehensive integrative mental health clinic in Fort Collins, Colorado, as a psychiatrist, acupuncturist, and researcher. And the discussion will be moderated by Stephanie Stewart, who is a holistic psychiatrist who brings a spiritual, environmental, and social just perspective to her work. She is also a member of Chacruna's board of directors and serves also on the Racial Equity and Access Committee in Chacruna. This will be a 1 hour conversation, and later we'll have a half hour for the questions. If you have any questions for the speakers throughout this forum, please feel free to put your questions on the Q&A button, which you can find near the chat. You also can upvote your favorite questions there. We encourage healthy and productive conversations and appreciate the participation of a diverse community. We ask that comments remain on topic and offered respectfully. If folks do not follow collegial rules and behave with disrespect, we exclude them from participating in this event and delete their messages from the chat. Disrespectful behavior includes name-calling, threats, hate speech, attacks toward people or identities, harassment, insults, and insulting profanity. Finally, when this event ends, you will find the recording at the same link. You can also find our previous and upcoming Crowdcast forums on the Chacruna Crowdcast channel. Thank you so much for being with us today. So welcome, everyone. And Stephanie, the word is yours.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you to our guests. We're going to have a great conversation today. I wanted to start out with asking you all to just orient us on a timeline where we are in the process of MDMA-assisted therapy approval.
Well, we basically have 31 days. The FDA has to respond within the next 31 days. They typically respond at the end of their deadlines. People are anticipating a response August 10th or 11th. My understanding is 11th is the hard stop for them. Have to respond by then.
And so there have been a couple of meetings of advisory committees. And can you tell us about those meetings and the function of them and really what the FDA's part of all of this is?
Well, I can jump in. The advisory committee was set up. It's an invitation, and they invited 12 members with a range of perspectives and positions. They invited a consumer or patient member, an industry member, and then a variety of experts from various different regions of inquiry. What's interesting is there was really no representation of psychedelic medicine or psychedelic research. Well, we can get into that, and I'm sure we will. But these folks create a non-binding vote about the safety and efficacy, basically the risk-benefit ratio of this treatment, and they give this non-binding advice to the FDA as part of their due diligence. So they met on June 4th, and I think all know the results of that vote.
Maybe I
think there's also some confusion. Maybe Ingmar, I was actually going to suggest maybe you explain the
ICER advisory group too, because there's some confusion about these various advisory capacities, and I know that advisory committee, which really has nothing to do with the FDA, has gotten a lot of press out there.
Yeah, happy to do that. And maybe because we have to unpack the FDA and we also have to unpack the ICER. Scott, just correct me if I'm wrong here, but just so that everybody knows, this advisory committee, my understanding is that it doesn't meet ahead of every single drug that is being examined for medication, but only those that maybe have a certain risk profile. So that's why the AdCom was put together ahead of MDMA. And then my other understanding about the advisory committee on the FDA side was that it can elevate questions and concerns that then the FDA can then take into further consideration. As sort of just more information about the purpose of the AdCom. As it pertains to ICER, now I'm forgetting the acronym there, but Institute for Clinical Economic Review. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And so there's much to be said here, but they are a nonprofit organization that is set up to evaluate new treatments and to do an analysis of whether there can be cost savings, also looking at the potential efficacy of the new treatments once they are, or if they are made available to the public post approval. And so if people have been following in the news, the ICER, they published a draft of their report looking at the Lykos research. That was sometime in March, I believe. Then they, I want to say a few weeks later, or maybe a month later, had a live online panel discussion. And then they finalized their ICER report in the beginning of June. And so these are sort of two different events. There's the ICER panel and final report, and then there's the FDA advisory committee that met, and we're anticipating the decision by the FDA. Maybe one thing I'll say more, I think is a really, really important point to stress that is often missed. Neither the ICER nor the FDA advisory panel had full access to the results of the FDA inspection. In other words, they don't have access to all of the data. The ICER had only access to public information, so what was mainly published by Lykos. And then also they did their own primary research. They did their own kind of investigation that ICER usually doesn't do. We can talk a little bit about that. And then the FDA advisory committee had two briefing documents, one from Lykos, and then another briefing document from the actual FDA itself. But that doesn't necessarily include all of the information that the actual FDA has, and that they'll be using that information to draw their final conclusion in August.
So I'm wondering about, the reason why I was asking sort of the role of the FDA was really getting at this being a novel application for both a therapy and a medication, and the familiarity with that. And how do we assess the value of psychotherapy combined with a medication?
Well, there's a couple caveats. One, the FDA has never evaluated a drug and a therapy combined together. So in their 60 whatever years of existence, they've never done this before. They do not have a mandate to evaluate or regulate psychotherapy. That's considered the practice of medicine, or whatever licensure and scope you fall under, and it's not in their jurisdiction. So there's an interesting challenge in that this is in some ways only half under their jurisdiction and half not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do think that many of the questions that came up were a reflection of this new way of approaching a treatment, this combination of therapy and drug. And so I think there were some important considerations that came to the surface. It was just the process didn't really give either the sponsor or the practitioners an opportunity to talk about some of those tensions and challenges and opportunities and how it's been actually working and how this innovative model was co-designed with the FDA. So from the very beginning, they gave their feedback and brought in consultants, and there were lots of people thinking about this, and it was developed with a lot of intention. And and any time you're the first to move something forward, there will be some things that need to be addressed. But I think that unfortunately, the whole structure for review was organized around reviewing a drug, and so there wasn't really an opportunity to think about how the intelligence of the design and to really reflect on how this was developed over time with a lot of people that put their hearts and best minds to the task. And so I hope that gap can be addressed over time.
It's interesting that MAPS then at the time, this was probably in 2017, probably just after Ingmar and I and Jamie got trained in this. They had a meeting with the FDA to agree to a special protocol agreement, an SPA, in which they dealt with functional unblinding because everybody in that room knew this was an issue. I think anybody who does psychedelic research knows that really blinding is relatively impossible. When you're trying to blind an experience, it's different than trying to blind a pharmacological effect. Those are totally different creatures. And the FDA and MAPS came to this agreement about what this would look like. The FDA initially suggested some active placebos, such as low-dose MDMA, which was rejected because in the MAP2 trial, that actually made people worse. And they suggested things like niacin or methylphenidate. These were discussed, and ultimately they came to an agreement. And, I'm just hoping the FDA honors this agreement. So most of the hysteria around functional unblinding is just part of psychedelic research, and it's something the FDA understood much better than anybody in the advisory committee.
Yeah, I just would like to add that to combine both of your points, Scott and Jamie. And Jamie, this is something you mentioned before we started, is that for an observer who was watching the FDA advisory committee, it created this impression that that Lykos was going rogue in some sense, that they weren't listening to the FDA at all. They were doing their own thing. They presented their briefing, and the advisory committee then has this sense that, well, why didn't Lykos why did they do this on their own without any guidance, which is, again, to Scott's point, is absolutely not the case.
Yeah, I think that the therapy being part of that too, and the question about lack of standardizing therapy and adherence rating and like speaking to the difficulty of standardizing therapy.
Yeah, if you don't mind if I take that one, just because it's this is my little obsession here, because it really bugs me. Scott had mentioned how there's a novelty here, that it's a combination of a drug and a psychotherapy. I think there's also a challenge in that my impression of the advisory committee is that they also didn't really have much background in psychotherapy research itself, pharmacology aside. And so what really bugged me was that I kept hearing the statement, why wasn't the treatment systematized? Which I think they were actually asking two things. You could either think of that as, why didn't they use an evidence-based treatment, which we could dive into and unpack. But it can also mean, well, why wasn't the therapy operationalized? Why wasn't it defined? Which is troubling for me, because it was so much so that, you can go online, you can find the adherence rating, which for people who aren't familiar, I like to compare it to, the recipe. If you're making a cake, what are the ingredients? How much of what and when do you use that? And so the operationalization of the MDMA therapy, the psychotherapy component of that was that dates back to about 2013 as the first draft of that. So they spent over 10 years finding ways to operationalize, define the therapy, then spend lots of money and human time to observe and rate the video sessions. So the idea that the psychotherapy component, I think somebody even said, so in the psychotherapy, anything goes. I'm not sure if that was in ICER or in the FDA advisory panel, but that absolutely is as far from the truth as you can get. And there is there's data also. Like, that's the thing. This is an empirical question. Lykos has the data in terms of adherence to the therapy method, who got what dose, was it delivered consistently? So that was just quite off the mark. And I want to sort of take a Steelman version of the AdCom, which I just want to think that they may be not even familiar with that process in psychotherapy research. I'm not sure, but that's sort of the perspective that I like to hold.
The thing that needs to be said here is that I'm talking with Kelly O'Donnell, who represented we clinicians up there in front of the FDA, and kudos to her. I think she did a great job. But she was in that room for the entire 8 hours. I was merely on Zoom, so I didn't have full access. But what Kelly said is that Lykos repeatedly asked the chair to be recognized to give feedback on these questions that came up, and the chair refused to recognize them. Obviously, the chair has that flexibility, but I think this talks a little bit about the tone and tenor of this discussion.
Yeah, and I would just throw in my 2 cents that it's unfortunate that because of these process challenges, and I think Lykos and the practitioners, the therapists and researchers, we felt that our perspective wasn't well represented. And so that kind of puts us on the defensive in a way. Whereas there were these really interesting questions that rise to the surface around who should be a practitioner in the room, what should their training be? How can you take practitioners from multiple kind of disciplines, various licensures, and put them in a space together and create standardization? I mean, I think for myself, coming from the field of palliative care, there are people from various, places that come and do, are a part of a team and do that work. And there are other models for kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work. But there are some really, really interesting questions that are hard to engage because we feel pretty defensive about a process that didn't feel great, and wasn't representative. But there are some really meaningful questions around how you pair therapy with medication, and how do you monitor that. And I hope that the FDA will approve, in August, and that there'll be ongoing research and clarification, and the MDMA will be explored by. I know that right now at Emory University there's an MDMA and prolonged exposure therapy study, and I hope there would be an MDMA and CBT, and some of this could be worked out over time. But the research experience that we all had was that it was very rigorous. It was collaborative with the FDA. It was rated by people who were independent raters, so they were, they were not participating in the research or anything. They were rating it. We never knew who they were. There were people rating my work, and I never saw them or knew who they were, and that was a very rigorous process as well. And there were clear standards for this method that was developed with a lot of intelligence from a lot of people who, are PhD, MD, psychiatrists. I mean, it wasn't developed by people that have some kind of religious agenda who are trying to bring psychedelics to the world. There's this real interest in I mean, the real motivation is to relieve the suffering that people are faced with every day in their daily lives, are leading to this extremely high suicide rate. And I mean, there's so much, the relief of suffering was the motivation for this. And there were a lot of people in good minds that came together to address it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, but it's just important to remember that some of the critique had this kind of hyperbolic quality to it. And there's real critique in there, that we want to pay attention to, but the way that it's presented by some of the folks is kind of exaggerated, to make a point, and maybe there's a sense that their voices won't be heard if they're not saying it in such an exaggerated way. But I would like to believe that we all care about these real genuine critiques and challenges, and we'll get into the misconduct issues soon. And we care almost more than maybe people observing from the outside, because we're in the middle of it. And so just wanted to say that it's hard not to be defensive, but
well, Jamie, I was offended. Exactly, Jamie, I was so offended by the ICER report that I flamed off a letter, a little bit heated, but basically I told them I was insulted by the insinuation that we were not taking our research seriously and did not conduct it scientifically, which is what they said, that the psychedelic research was done by enthusiasts. And they painted us in a picture like we were out to make sure the data said whatever we wanted it to say. And I found that pretty insulting. And I think that just remarks, there was a couple other points in the ICER report, one where it was based on hearsay. They didn't document that they'd heard. And it just did not have the flavor of a solid scientific report. I think it was the launch pad for the hysteria and groupthink that the AdCom committee became. And it's unfortunate that it just proceeded, and it wasn't interrupted by data or feedback or corrective input. And that's really sad.
Ingmar, you were talking a little bit about Section 2.1 and that process, and that feels like that fits into this, but I also really do want to get into what you were saying, Jamie, about ethical misconduct, and then also, just bigger institutional change in that process, and more. But we have just about 8 minutes before starting to take audience questions and answers. So let's start with that, the Section 2.1, if that feels like now's a good time.
Yeah, I think it's quite a lengthy conversation that I'm very happy to have. I think this is essentially what Scott was alluding to. I'll just say one comment about it, which is what I was struck by is ICER's own admission that they don't do primary research. In other words, they look at the data that's publicly available. They don't put in their own effort to then interview past participants or speak to other experts, that quote unquote experts that were involved in some of the allegations. And so to me, that's a weakness of the ICER report. I can empathize or understand why they might want to do that primary research if they're hearing something that is quite worrisome in their mind, or they listen to a podcast that made them want to do extra due diligence. But I do want to say that what it led them to doing is doing their own research, and it's the way that they conducted their research wasn't to make an appeal broadly for anybody to speak to them, although I think they would be open to it. It seemed like they were speaking to certain people with a particular kind of bias and lens. And that then I think led them to create that 2.1 section. They actually, I think, stated explicitly. And that's how I think it got that, in my view, quite an imbalanced tone to it, which, as Scott said, was sort of a precursor to what we saw at the AdCom.
Let's jump into the ethical issues. I think that's on a lot of people's minds, and as an ethicist, I would love to hear some of your thoughts about that, Jamie.
Yeah, and I think we do have about another hour still, so we probably could revisit some of those FDA related questions. If people have questions about the process and the timelines, please put that into the chat.
We have time. Okay, I apologize.
No, that's okay. We'll circle back around. It's all interrelated. So yeah, some of the most vocal critics of who spoke publicly at the ICER hearing and also at the FDA hearing are deeply troubled and concerned, and rightly so, about the sexual misconduct case that happened in phase 2 of the MDMA-assisted therapy study process. And for those of you that aren't aware of what happened, there was a participant who was sexually exploited by one of the 2 therapists, and the other therapist sort of, I don't know the story in depth, but didn't prevent the misconduct from happening and knew about it, basically.
They were a married couple.
They were a married couple, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the spouse knew about it, but she happened to and didn't prevent it. And then if you actually review the videos of the sessions, there are some transgressions that happen in the actual sessions, and that was put forward by the Cover Story podcast, and I think in collaboration with Symposia. And so this case of misconduct, there might be a tendency on the part of some folks to say, well, it's kind of an outlier. This was a bad apple. It's not something we need to spend much time with because it was addressed and the person's no longer working in the study. But my perspective is that, it should never have happened. Clearly, the fact that it did happen should give us all pause to think about what are the risks, with this therapy, because it puts people in these non-ordinary states of consciousness. There's a lot of vulnerability. Many people who have PTSD have this, set of symptoms as a result of sexual violation or sexual assault. And so it's a real question. But what I would like us to think about is just to expand this and more broadly into the helping professions. This issue of misconduct is a deep issue in psychotherapy. There are some studies we could quote that it might be startling to some people about how often it happens just in the broader field in the helping professions. More generally, in my experience in the world of religion and religious practice, there are obviously a lot of problems there. Physicians transgress boundaries sometimes, and so how we set up how we try to prevent this as much as we're able to, and then also address it, is a really important question for the field. And I don't think any of us would say that we should not have dentistry because a certain percentage of dentists transgress someone's boundaries, and that has to be addressed. And there have been things that, new processes in place to try to prevent that. But anytime you have a vulnerable person who's seeking help from a professional, there's going to be a certain degree of risk. So I think it's good that this has come forward in the field for us to think about and think about deeply. I also think that in the protocols, especially in phase 3, which is what many of us participated in the phase 3 process after this terrible case happened, and everything was videotaped. There's 2 therapists in the room, which is unusual for practitioners to have 2 people in the room with video, and those videos were, many of the videos were reviewed. I don't think every single one was reviewed. And so we're in this situation where we have PTSD is a real condition that needs help. We have a therapy that can bring relief to people. I hope in this forum we can just have the understanding that there might be some subtlety with the data, but that there's clearly benefit from MDMA therapy for people with PTSD. because the data demonstrates the benefit. And I think we're not going to question that here in this space, because we trust the scientific minds and the FDA review and of the people that are actually part of the FDA, and not this, brief AdCom process where there was a lot of confusion going on. So we have to balance really the benefit for people who are suffering from PTSD and who are waiting for real relief and waiting for therapies with some of the risks. And this is what happens in the field of medicine all the time, with balancing risk and benefit. And I hope that we can do everything we can possibly do, and perhaps that wasn't done 100% in phase 2, that we can do everything we can possibly do to prevent and then immediately address when things happen. But I think it's unrealistic to say that there is no degree of risk and that we can zero out any potential risk, because that's not true in any helping profession with any therapy that I'm aware of that has this kind of transformative potential. I mean, mental health care it's a bigger question for the broader field. And so I don't think it means that we should cancel the, progress of MDMA-assisted therapy for thousands, millions of people that need this therapy. So that's my perspective. There are diverse perspectives within the community, and I think that's also important to highlight, that we're not like a monolithic community where everyone has the same perspective about this kind of balancing effect, and how we and we could try to review the case, but I don't have deep knowledge of all parts of it. I just know that it should have never happened. That's clear. It was a terrible situation. There could have been things perhaps that might have prevented it from happening. But as we know in other fields, we do everything that we can, and sometimes harm still happens, and it has to be addressed immediately.
I'll just build on that, Jamie, and say that we know in this work, those of us that do it, that we have increased vulnerability and increased sort of rapport and alignment with the person we're working with. And that creates a real fulcrum for potential abuse. And I think this requires us to be even more pristine in our ethics and in our own self-work. And this is on us, and we need to do this. But until we have a specialty certification, until we have boards that hold us to different standards, it all reverts back to our current licensure. And in our current licensure, this is all against the law. And not only can you be criminally prosecuted, but you can also face civil suits. So I think we just need to be clear that this is a risk, and maybe accelerated in the work we do, but we have to be vigilant and pay attention to these concerns.
I'd like to also expand this out a little bit. There's actually, just as a footnote or side note, that I think there's a lot more to say about how we were trained to deliver the therapy component, and the kind of fundamentals of the therapy component that we could dive into some more to explore the intersection of a violation and actually how we practice in the studies. But I just want to bookmark that and share another kind of allegation, or rather, there's another kind of allegation of misconduct, right? I don't want to say that the sexual violation was an allegation. It's provenly, it happened, right? There's no question about that. But another kind of misconduct that has been alleged is around how we as therapists and researchers were managing or handling the data in the studies. And so I want to zoom in on one particular example and unpack it. So as well known, people who struggle with PTSD often also have suicidal ideation or history of suicidal behavior, and those participants were included in these studies. And the FDA actually had particular interest in following suicidal ideation or behavior. And we administered something called the CSSRS, which is the Columbia Suicide Rating Scale. Yeah, we administered it so much that we yeah. It's if you're in the studies, you kind of but I mean, it goes to show. It was almost at every single interaction that we had with a participant, sometimes multiple times on a single day, that we administered this scale to assess the severity and frequency of either both suicidal ideation and behavior. And so fast forward, a past participant from these trials is speaking, let's say, I'm going to make this kind of hypothetical. They're speaking at a public event and they're talking about how they, at the end of the trial, had suicidal ideation. And then maybe an astute listener might look at some of the published research on the trial and may see that in some way they see that that's not reflected in the write-up. So there's a discordance between what participants are saying about their own suicidal ideation and then what is being reported in the written published peer-reviewed papers. And some people, some critiques of this research have said, oh, well, this is an evidence of Lycos or us trying to hide or not report incidences of adverse events. This is actually a really important point to it. And so they're saying, well, why are there only certain why aren't these adverse events of suicidal ideation reported? And so some people in the public jump to a conclusion that we're somehow trying to manipulate the data. But to put a little bit of a finer point on it, in the FDA trials, in order for, it's not sufficient for suicidal ideation to or behavior to occur. It has to be a increase in either intensity or frequency from baseline. So you can have somebody who is reporting suicidal ideation, but does not qualify as an adverse event. So this is all, and there are other incidences that I am aware of accusations where from somebody who's not necessarily aware of the fine-tuned aspects of clinical research, that something can seem to be not reported, or other kinds of allegations when it's in fact just a part of the research. It didn't meet that threshold to be an adverse event. So hopefully that's clear. Now, the other thing I also, before I wrap up, just want to say is, look, we were 12 or 13 sites. We know what happened at our sites. We don't know what happened at every single site. Lycos knows this. The FDA knows this. So I want to be open to the fact that maybe there was a researcher therapist out there who was engaging in some sort of activity that was trying to fudge the data in some way. Like, I want to stay open-minded to that critique. But I also want to say that I know of specific incidences where it's being perceived as the data being fudged when that's actually not the case.
Thank you all for that. Wondering too about like ethics in a sense, but leading back into more details of the study and as far as like long-term follow-up. And then phase 2 data's longitudinal outcomes. Were there any considerations both ethically, and then what did that look like clinically?
Well, I wasn't part of phase 2. I was part of phase 3, but I mean, there are limitations with an FDA study because it has to be time limited, and there are certain time frames that the therapy happens within. And I have no doubt that there were some people who could have benefited from continued care, continuing to be in our care. And I mean, we could get into a deeper discussion of research ethics in general, which would be really interesting. But we did our best in my experience to transition people into care that would support them beyond the length of the study. Did everybody, fall into the kind of support that they needed? I'm not sure that we were able to guarantee that, because it was a research study, time limited. And so, yeah, as someone who, this was the first research study I participated on, it was challenging for me, to have these time limitations that prioritize the data as in while we're also balancing the needs of the participants. And we added sessions sometimes for people that needed that. We really tried to flex the protocol, but there's a certain integrity of the data that we were also trying to assure. And so that creates this ethical tension that's, that's challenging. But maybe Scott, you could speak to the integrity of the long-term data, but overall it shows improvement. And that's clear, that even if not everyone was caught, and even if there were some issues around, perhaps people feeling, because it is a therapeutic process with psychotherapeutic method, perhaps some people felt abandoned when the study ended, and we did our best to hand off. But overall, the data demonstrates that there was continued improvement over time, and that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think it's because we're addressing root cause. We're helping people actually digest their trauma, because we remove the barriers that are typically present in other treatments, which is, i.e., terror induced by the limbic system and amygdala. So, let's talk about long-term data. So the study ends at 2 months post-treatment, and then we have a separate study that looks at people a year plus out. And a couple things that I can tell you from running a lot of different studies, it's very difficult to track people down. They move, they change their phone numbers, they decide they don't want to deal with this anymore, whatever the reasons are. It's very difficult to get people to stay plugged in. So that's one piece. And yeah, I would agree that we made every effort to engage people as best we could. The other thing you need to realize is that these people had severe levels of trauma, and that typically they had 2 layers of trauma, which was developmental childhood trauma, on top of some other index event that they had perhaps more in their adult years. And inevitably, what we saw is that when we brought people into treatment, their first session or 2 was often talking about their early childhood stuff, which they may have not even noted as a problem. And I would guess that probably 70-80% of the people that we treated in this study, 3 sessions was completely insufficient to address what they needed. And that maybe we needed 5 or 4 or 6. And frankly, some people could have probably gone through and done 3 a year for multiple years, because this often creates lots of processing and digestion of trauma. So yes, most everyone at the end of that study was not completely cured. We did have a significant number of people that really had complete remission, complete resolution of their symptoms. That was significant. But a lot of these people did not. And we just have to be clear, too, that we're also dealing with, personality issues are often mixed in here. And some of the long-term follow-up was complicated by the fact that people went and got ketamine or MDMA, I think in both groups. And so it makes it very challenging. Long-term follow-up studies are very, very difficult to complete.
Maybe one thing I'll just quickly add is that also we were doing this research in the most intense period of COVID. So the first half of phase 3 was wrapping up when COVID struck began, and then was ongoing for the remainder of the second half of phase 3. And so that was, I think, also an additional challenge to follow up. And I wish I knew what is the kind of average rate of follow up for these kinds of trials. My impression is that we're nowhere below standard response rates. Again, I don't know that for a fact, but I think the response rates are pretty solid.
Well, to give you a comparison, I think maybe we need to take a couple minutes just to compare what the current treatment stats are for treating PTSD. So the current idealized treatment, the first line of treatment, is psychologically based therapies for PTSD. 50% of the people drop out immediately because they can't tolerate re-experiencing or re-engaging with their trauma. And we certainly saw that in our placebo group. We had a 33% dropout rate. And this was really engaging people very strongly. But often the people would drop out after their first placebo event, their experimental session. So 50% of people drop out immediately, and then only 50% of people that sustain through that very difficult and painful process get benefit and find resolution. Our medications are much less effective. We're still using sertraline and paroxetine, which were approved in 1991 and 1992. And their effect size, according to a recent study, was 0.23, and it compares to the effect size we saw in our study of 0.9. So nearly 4 times better than our current existing treatments, at least with medication. And we have 13 million people in the US. We spend $232 billion in costs on PTSD in this country. The Department of Defense alone, the VA, spends over $3 billion. This is a horrific need. There is just incredible unmet suffering. And if the FDA is going to give us a green light, a thumbs up in August, it's going to be because of the unmet need. And, you know, it is just so massive and incalculable. We don't have any modern advances in this century. I mean, that is a sad statement. But I think this is where MDMA is going to shine, because we actually have some real deep benefit.
And I'm curious, Scott, if this resonates with you, and maybe all of you. For myself, you know, having worked in trauma settings and worked with people who have been through really terrible life events and childhood experiences, to be able to work with a therapy that actually can, like you said, I would maybe use the language of transmute, or you said digest, you know, integrate those experiences in a way so people often leave the treatment feeling like they're not dealing with the kinds of symptoms that they lived with for many, many years. It was remarkable as a practitioner to experience that with someone after being in this field where there's so little relief for people that are faced with this profound kind of suffering in their daily lives. And it's hard to convey that to people that maybe don't, you know, in our training, we would watch training videos with a lot of obviously confidentiality and informed consent, and a lot of process around that to ensure the holding the training videos with the utmost kind of really care, you know, so that no one saw those who wasn't supposed to, and it was only people that were okay with their videos being reviewed as part of training processes. But watching other therapists, you know, sit with people, and it's not that there aren't risks and there aren't challenges and problems that need to be worked out over time, but the remarkable recovery of some of these folks just was so striking to me. And I imagine as a psychiatrist over time, this would have been really powerful for you to experience also, having tried to, you know, treat this in a lot of other ways that just don't compare.
Oh my God, yes. The suffering is so deep. I mean, the average participant we had in the study had PTSD for over 14 years and had tried multiple courses of medication and multiple courses of evidence-based psychotherapy and failed all those. And that is the sort of status quo of PTSD treatment in this country, in the world right now. And it's just so much suffering.
Yeah, and I am aware that there are some, you know, there's some success with prolonged exposure therapy in some parts of the U.S. and some, you know, contexts. Like I know at Emory University, they have developed some PTSD treatments that that work over time, not to the degree that we've seen in this research. But my hope is that those therapies would be paired with this modality, and then we would have even higher success rates. There are little pockets, I think, of treatments that are successful, but I think overwhelmingly, if someone has PTSD in this country and they go in for treatment, they could face re-traumatization or worsening symptoms, or just be over-medicated and managed, rather than walked through a real transformative healing process.
I've heard Chantal make this point that that the failure isn't necessarily on the patient or the participant, but it may not just be the right fit or match, either whether it's the therapeutic alliance with the therapist or the approach, the treatment. And so, whereas prolonged exposure can work for some, for those for whom it was not helpful, perhaps MDMA-assisted therapy could be another solution or a solution for them. I wanted to just jump back to second on the topic of long-term follow-up. And, it's sort of a combination of ethics and long-term follow-up. We've heard publicly some participants critique or be critical of the study because in essence, they wanted more, which I think it's important to sort of pause and reflect on, right? That's not necessarily a limitation of the therapeutic approach of the drug or the MDMA itself. It really is a limitation of the clinical trial research, which it's, the study has to end at some point. And also it's really expensive to run these trials, right? Every additional dosing session, the integration sessions, the timing. And so I don't really see that as a failure of Lycos or of us or of researchers, but rather an indication that somebody was feeling like their therapeutic process was in route, or it was unfolding, and they felt that it was discontinued too early, which I think we all here have a lot of understanding and empathy for, and we wish we could do otherwise. But that's not a reason to say, I don't think that's a valid reason to say that the data should be discounted, or that that should be a reason for the treatment to be considered.
I agree. One piece that I want to add before we move into questions is this is really a significant paradigm shift in mental health. And we haven't had a paradigm shift in mental health since the 1950s, when we started to use psychopharm. And if we look at what we're doing in mental health at this point, based on psychopharm, it really hasn't changed that much in 70 years. Our agents change a little, but our process is still the same. And we're doing talk therapy, not that much different than what Sigmund Freud did 120 years ago. And this is really a significant paradigm shift. We're combining medication and psychotherapy to change what's going on in an inner process and change experience, awareness, insight, and access to memories and trauma. And let's not downplay the fact that this paradigm shift is threatening to institutions, practitioners, and it represents a novel mindset that is significantly different. And I think part of what we're seeing here is institutional resistance and institutional fear, individual fear, based on a paradigm shift that people are afraid of, don't understand, and want to reject out of hand because it's threatening. And, this is how innovation occurs, and this is how change is going to come to mental health. And, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc of science is long, but it bends towards data. And we've got data, and we're going to have to fight through this resistance. But, I think the data stands for itself, and I'll stand by that data.
Where else do you think that the resistance to this innovation comes from?
Well, I wanted to say a little bit about the hype, because there was a lot of discussion in the ICER process, and then also in the I think they kind of are a little bit confused in my head, but I did watch both of the hearings and the AdCom FDA hearing. There's a general sense that, you know, participants might have done well because they expected to do well, and because of all of this hype that they had heard, you know, these miracle stories, and then they arrived to the therapy with high expectations, and it was the kind of placebo effect that led to the positive outcomes. And I would just say that in my experience, and it wasn't comprehensive, and unfortunately, this wasn't studied more thoroughly. And I think moving forward, having more data around expectancy would be helpful. But in my experience, many of the participants came, and I did a lot of screenings, as well as, you know, the participants that I sat with with the experimental treatment. And there were the majority of the people, I would say, came with more of a sense of hopelessness. You know, they've tried everything. Were kind of wanting to hope that this would work, but feeling like, you know, there's this vulnerability and risk in getting their hopes up after years. You know, there were several veterans from the Iraqi war, and I mean, it's been how many decades, you know, that they've been suffering from this kind of demoralization and PTSD and hypervigilance, and, you know, with all this impact on their families and their, you know, years of suicidality, and to hope that some work is a risk. And so I experienced more kind of like, well, I'll give it a try, and I'm here, you know, maybe this is like my last resort. And so the expectancy data, or the sense of like it was the hype that cured it all, I think is also an approach used by people that have, again, real concerns about this therapy integrating into the field, and maybe some fears, like Scott is saying. But the idea that hype itself could cure PTSD, to me, is just, anyone who's had PTSD, it just, you know, jumping up and down and having like a cheerleader team, you know, rooting you on, is not going to cure your PTSD. Or the strongest placebo effect out there, I think, cannot penetrate some of this deep trauma that people brought into this study. And so, is there hype? Yes, there's hype. And is there a hype bubble that maybe is bursting and maybe should burst? Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about this paradigm shift, and perhaps, you know, that excitement is now being sort of corrected with a more sober approach overall. And if you just look at psychedelic therapy across the board, is not going to cure everything. It won't cure everyone. Not everyone in the study did better. But to use this as a strategy to question the data overall, just to those of us who were there in the room with people, just does not hold the kind of weight that the critics are maybe hoping that it will. But I personally experienced more hopelessness than I did expectancy, and I hope that we can study it over time to get a clear picture.
And Stephanie, you asked about resistance. I would say the resistance comes from both ends of the spectrum. I think it comes from people that are so fully immersed in either the psychotherapeutic or the psychopharmacological approach to mental illness that they can't see anything outside that. And then those would be the most conventional sort of institutional resistance. And it's interesting that we see resistance at the other end. In some ways, the far left, the most progressive in our movement, who feel that this should remain underground and sacred, and that commercialization is just an expansion of colonialistic and capitalistic agendas. And, you know, I think in some ways, the far left is hurting us far more than the far right in this, if you use that sort of ideological spectrum, because they have had a dedicated focus attack on MAPS and LICOs for the last, you know, 3 years that I've noticed, a pretty consistent agenda by a number of these agents to sink this effort because of moral outrage. A great article by Daniel Pinchbeck on his Substack about this a couple of weeks ago, really telling to me.
I want to just express my, so if it is okay if I just say a few things?
Of course.
Yeah, I just want to express my agreement with Scott on that one, and extend it from 3 years to 6 years, at least, in terms of that attention. And Jamie, just to build off of something you had said, well, I guess I have a little bit of just respectful disagreement, because I can also understand from the scientific perspective around how I agree that expectation, I'm very skeptical that can fully cure people's PTSD. I don't agree with that. But, that I do think that expectation can play a role in terms of its impact on how people might report outcomes. But I also want to anecdotally add some of my own experience that might call that into question. So something that I would noticed quite often amongst participants as they were going through the trial was a concern that after they had the first, very often after the second session, they felt like that the third session was their last chance. Like they have to do this right. If they don't get it right, whatever that means, there was a sense that they have to do something in order to be successful. So it wasn't at all, I never encountered a participant that after their first session, like their expectation was met and therefore they were feeling better immediately. And several times I actually encountered the opposite of that, which is after we're terminating or saying goodbye to our participant for the last session, afterwards my co-therapist and I turn to each other and we say, well, we don't know if this person is going to get better, because sometimes the improvement actually wasn't evident by the third session. There's a case that I had where we really didn't know, and the improvement really wasn't the evidenced until at the follow-up period. So again, that to me the narrative around the expectation being fully responsible for it just doesn't add up from an anecdotal perspective.
Yeah, and just I can tell you want to get in, Scott, too, but I just want to say one more thing, which is, would you want to be in even if it's experimental, in a treatment session with someone who wasn't hoping that you're going to get better? Maybe could be a good conversation about the difference between expectation and hope or something. But all of us, I think, and we didn't know if someone was receiving placebo or the experimental treatment, but for each person, in order to be therapeutically aligned with them, I had to access hope, hope that they would find relief and that I could be a part of that process of the relief finding. And did I personally believe that MDMA was going to solve everyone's problems in that room? Absolutely not. And I think most of us did not. I don't know of anyone that saw it as a miracle cure, that you just hand someone a pill and they're going to be cured. We were all investigators and we were deeply investigating this therapy. And so, maybe expectancy just challenges the biomedical research model in some interesting ways, like the blinding challenge does.
What's interesting, I'm agreeing with both of you, is that the most common scenario we saw is that people got worse after their first session when they got MDMA, because they unpacked more trauma and there was more for us to deal with. They were in despair and overwhelmed, and we often had to pull them back from the brink. There was not a lot of euphoria and dancing after the first session.
Yeah, and to that, I know that some critics have brought that forward as that this therapy is too risky. But I also want to convey that, we were calling people daily. We were in constant communication. If someone needed to be hospitalized, that conversation would happen. If, there was a lot of assessment around, do people have enough support? Is someone's driving them home? Will someone be with them overnight, or they'd stayed on site? And so the safety precautions were extensive, and that also didn't really come through, in the review processes. That it appeared as if we just gave someone MDMA, opened up this, like Scott said, memories of trauma and all of this challenge, and then just drop someone out, send them home in a taxi or something like that. And that's not what the process was like in any way.
if I can just ask one more question before we go to the audience Q&A, is that another big piece that was brought up was around spirituality. And I think the way that it was brought up by the advisory committees was questionable at best, demonized, not to be funny, but that word, really seen as a drawback or a detrimental aspect, whether that be come from the therapists or just a part of the therapy itself. And, as we're talking about this big paradigm shift in institutional organizations, I wonder if that's a part of it, and just overall, how can science reconcile with spirituality?
Well, don't get me going on this, because I'm sure any and all of us could jump off. But I think it's just talking about a perspective. One of the reasons why there's such a psychedelic renaissance across culture and formats, and it's global. What's happening right now is there's a spiritual hunger. It's because our science has excluded spirit, soul, and psyche from consideration, and we've lost contact with this, and people are hungry for it. And I think what we need to do, and what we did in the study, is basically just open up and be able to listen to any and all that was brought to us. We didn't have a spiritual agenda, but I think we had a willingness, because there's now good evidence with psychedelic therapies, people's perspective often shifts and they become more interested and engaged around spiritual topics. But to say that it's a cult because we open a discussion about that and include it in our consideration is really part of the hysteria, I think.
Yeah, and maybe perhaps the narrative about the cult sort of filled a vacuum of, a lack of discussions around spiritual assessment and how we do that work. Well, Scott, how do we train practitioners to be able to assess spiritual needs and resources and support that, and not bring their biases into the room? But I hope that it's clear to the community at large, in spite of this narrative about the cult and the hype and this kind of religious fervor behind psychedelics, that there's a broad diversity of perspectives and approaches within the community. There certainly isn't some kind of monolithic, like we're all devoted to one sort of spiritual approach, and we're all coming from, we all meet on Zoom every Sunday to the psychedelic church of MDMA or something, and we're trying to propagate that out in the community. I mean, it could not be further from the truth. We have people that are deeply rooted in a biomedical model who are, approaching spirituality from that point of view. We have people that have psychotherapeutic perspectives on spirituality. Some of us have worked in religious studies and have deeply, secularly rooted perspectives on the role of spirituality and religion in healing processes and in therapeutic processes. And over time, I hope these conversations will become really robust, and we'll sort out what is the appropriate training for a practitioner, and how do we weave this as a secular society? How do we weave all of these perspectives in to this therapeutic model in a good way, to be inclusive and also respectful of indigenous traditions, which some of these protocols have borrowed heavily from. So there's a lot of deep questions here that can be explored, but we're certainly not some kind of monolithic or just group that pays homage in some certain way to some singular approach to this. That to those of us who are practicing in this world, that just feels really could not be further from the truth. We're a group of people that have deep disagreements. We have engaged conversations. We're sorting this out through research and through through the kinds of forums that Chacruna hosts. And there's a lot of diversity. That's all I can say about it. There's no cult that I'm able to perceive in this community, unless I haven't been invited.
Add in the chat a link to preprint that peer review. I think should be peer review for publish. That speaks to the conceptual framework it's off by researchers who like those trials. It's in the chat. For any you would like to dive into this, to say quickly that one of the critiques of the quote unquote spirituality is around this concept of the inner healing intelligence, which I think this critique comes from a misreading or misunderstanding or an outsider's view of what that concept is. Briefly, it's the idea that the participant or the client has inside them recognizing their capacity to get better, and in fact that they are in some ways the expert in their own lives. And I think it's a really key component to our work because it orientates the relationship between the therapist and the participant. But at no point in the trial do we force the participant to adopt this concept of the inner healing intelligence. We might say, this is one idea. This is how we like to orient towards you, that, you have this innate wisdom and capacity to get better. And we elicit, well, what aligns for you? Would it be wisdom? Would it be intuition? Or does this just not even sound right at all? So there was a lot of flexibility around how we introduce this. It is part of the therapeutic model, but the kind of one critique around the spirituality intentionally creates this impression that this is a dogma that we are trying to induce the participants into, and that is absolutely can't be further from the truth. And it's just a cartoon version of the treatment.
And the concept that we have the ability to heal ourselves goes back before Hippocrates, and has been a consistent thread, through C.G. Jung and on through Abraham Maslow and others in the humanistic movement. It's not novel. It's just that we're bringing it to mental health to, in some ways, push back on the pathological view that we're broken and we need medications to fix us. So, I agree.
Yeah, and there are some concerns that that would be, again, interesting to have a deep conversation around with the work of Groff and others who put some of these ideas forward. But I think it's important to realize that most of us are not following in that lineage. We're not part of that lineage, and that inner healing intelligence is this basic idea that the psyche, the body, has this innate capacity to heal, and that we're trying to create the conditions by which that can happen. It's very generative, very positive, and it does challenge the biomedical model that tends to approach the body and the psyche as, something broken in need of repair by outside influences. And so it's important to separate out like the Groff lineage from the inner healing intelligence, and just recognizing the diversity in the field, that we're not all part of the same lineages, but this basic core concept to organize the therapy in really important ways.
And I'd even like to take the Steelman version of the critique of the inner healing intelligence, where things go off the rails and can start getting into the territory of something unethical or mistreatment, is where the therapist begins to interpret the inner healing intelligence for the patient or participant. The idea like, well, I understand what you really need, or this is what your inner healing intelligence is telling you. That is really antithetical to this idea that the expertise is coming from, or the direction is coming from the participant. And I think that is what we actually saw in that case of the violation that happened in Canada that Jamie spoke to earlier. So I just want to say that it's not that this concept can't be misused, but I think when applied correctly, it can be important. I think it's maybe even an essential part of the treatment process.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I'm going to jump over to some of the questions that are in the chat. So switching topics, I'm just going to read this one. One of the questions that came up was surrounding ICER's claim safety data collection relied on site therapists, unlike the primary and secondary study outcomes, which were assessed by blinded and independent raters. If you could speak to this adverse effects issue.
Well, in the adverse effects, a physician is required to sign off on it. So that's one piece. The second piece is that for map 2, the form was redesigned so that the physician's signature was central as opposed to a sign-off, but the process was always the same.
And
I also added,
you commented here.
Yeah, I can just add a little piece to it, which is that definitely what Scott had said, also that it wasn't just the therapists that were monitoring adverse events. There were also site physicians and other staff members at different points. But one of the challenges is that if you have an 8-hour dosing session, it's the therapists who are in the room, and when there are acute physiological changes that are happening that are adverse events. And again, this gets confusing. Just to unpack this, adverse sounds like it necessarily has to, I mean, it's sometimes defined as untoward, but things like pupil dilation is an adverse event, or there are other adverse events. There's expected and then unexpected ones, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be untoward. My point being that, like, who else to record and observe those adverse events than the therapists who were in the room during that time, unless you wanted to add an additional person to sit there whose job is only to note adverse events.
Yeah, there was interesting discussion around abuse potential, and it wasn't until the end of phase 3 that the therapist started and the clinical research team started reviewing what might be considered like positive adverse events or adverse events that could contribute to abuse potential. And so I do think that my understanding is that Lykos moving forward, if the FDA approves this therapy, will be paying more attention to abuse potential in the data that we'll be tracking, and that could have been something from the beginning that might have been meaningful to track more closely. Like, does someone who has a positive, like euphoric experience of MDMA, are they likely to go out and then like abuse MDMA following the research study? And that's an important question to pay attention to. At the same time, there was this weird discussion in the FDA AdCom where I think it was the chair, said that, well, it seems like after MDMA study, someone might be likely to go home and use cocaine. And to us, that just seems ludicrous. Why would you go home from a therapy treatment session and pull out your cocaine, unless it's to relieve some deep distress that you might have or something? But it isn't like a party in that room. The therapy, it's very rigorous and very serious intentional therapy. And so I think there's a little bit of paranoia around drugs. But on the other hand, there is a real, I have interest in understanding, like, is there increased abuse potential when someone has a euphoric experience? And I think in all of the psychedelic therapies, we should be thinking about this and tracking it. And it was added to the protocol, but not until sort of the end of phase 3. And I'd be curious to know. I mean, we didn't see a lot of people go out and become like, more frequent drug users or substance users after they left the study, but I'm only relying on my own perspective in that analysis. I would be surprised if people feel better, they're likely to turn to substances less, is my experience of the human condition.
We should monitor them for oppression for electronic dance music.
Well, there are phase 2 data where they did follow-ups and asked questions around substance use, and there was no there were no substance use disorders that were induced after the treatment from phase 2.
There's no signal here. We can hypothetically worry, but there's no signal.
Yeah. Maybe one thing to also, I think the adverse events topic is very interesting. The positive ones in particular. I'll say for the participants that I've worked with, I didn't have a single one tell me, oh, I'm feeling really high right now. I mean, to use that word, but anything like that. They were really immersed in their experience in sort of the therapeutic context, and there were physiological signs that I could see. There are things that maybe but there wasn't a lot of I'm feeling bliss right now, which often people report. That's a known effect of MDMA. I'm not denying that, but it's a research methodology question. Like, what do we do? Do we have a battery of sort of expected MDMA effects that then we sort of at some time point in the therapy session have the participant fill out to see if they've felt this way or that way? It's hard to do because with adverse events, you need to identify an onset, when it started, when it stopped, and if it's ongoing. And then there's an even more subtle piece to this, which, we're focusing on things like liabilities potential in terms of, say, a blissful experience. But what about something like enhanced capacity for trust or closeness? I think that anecdotally, I'm not sure if there are healthy human studies that look at this, but I think we could certainly make a strong inference that people on MDMA feel close to others when they take it, oxytocin release, et cetera. But trust is also a natural, well, not natural, it should be a natural product of psychotherapy. Hopefully you're feeling trusting of your therapist. And so when does the natural trust that develops through a relationship intersect with the drug effect of the MDMA? And then how do you untangle one from the other? I mean, it's going to be hopefully an ongoing thing after the study is over, that the participants still feel a sense of trust with the people that they worked with. So it's an interesting methodological question to note.
There's also a question about people accessing MDMA-assisted therapy if it's approved in August, and what that timeline might look like, and certification process for practitioners.
A couple things. So if the decision happens on August 11th, then the DEA has 3 months to reschedule if it's a positive decision. The DEA then has 3 months to reschedule, which brings us to December 11th. Currently, Lykos is anticipating that early January will be the commercial release date. And a couple other pieces that Lykos has shared and maybe knowledge is that they're going to be training people for free. The training programs will be free. And the big challenge is going to be the live supervision piece that has to occur. And that's going to be the pinch point, the bottleneck in the process. And that's the certification piece, I think, that you were talking about, is how do you get access to a live patient to co-treat with and have supervision with.
Yeah, and also the rollout is going to be very deliberate and very closely monitored. So just to clear up any misunderstanding that suddenly this will be available far and wide, it will be hard to access at first, and very deliberately rolled out. There probably won't be as many clinics as, I mean, there certainly won't be enough to meet the need at first. And hopefully, Lykos is going to prioritize marginalized communities and people who have, communities where there's a lot of need and a lot of PTSD present. And so I think it will be deliberate and very, very closely monitored. So not like a free for all, I mean, it's like called phase 4 for a reason. It's like phase 4 of the research. And so very carefully rolled out.
The tighter the REMS are, the more restrictive Lykos is going to be with the rollout. They're anticipating that it may be small and then build. They want it to build over 18 months, but they want to manage potential catastrophes up front. And data collection is going to be a big piece for them.
If it doesn't pass, there'll be, I think there'll be more research studies that will continue to move forward. The results are compelling and the momentum is clearly there. So I think my hope is that in a few years, insurance will provide MDMA therapy for people who have serious, severe PTSD in safe settings. And I think that we can still hope that comes to pass.
I'm optimistic about it. I really am that it will pass. We can't predict, but I'm just feeling optimistic. And maybe just one other thing to add on to this, the deliberate rollout is, we talked a little bit about ICER and the FDA advisory panel in terms of how much this drug plus psychotherapy combination is novel, how it challenges institutions. I think that's also true for the places where these treatments provide delivery. So I think it makes sense to do a deliberate, careful rollout for the first, I'm not speaking on behalf of Lycos, but for the first year or so, just to understand how do these systems, these different, whether it be a hospital or a clinic network, how are they able to, what challenges and barriers do they experience as they are trying to deliver this, and then identifying those barriers and challenges, solving them, and then you begin to scale up. You could really overload the system and have increased failures if you're trying to push something that is quite novel through a system that's not prepared for it.
I have one more question just because we have a few minutes left. So in looking at what could happen if this doesn't go through immediately, and considering even if it does, it's going to be a slow rollout, I'm wondering about the adjustments that could be made or maybe should be made in the meantime. And looking ahead, here's really the part of the question. Looking ahead at what other pharmaceutical companies may be doing in light of this decision, what do you think about taking the psychedelic experience out of psychedelics as one potential outcome, or that people are beginning to look into? So that's a few questions there. Yeah, what about taking psychedelics out of psychedelics, and how may we adjust going forward?
Yeah, just real briefly, I would say we can't solve the problem by canceling the relationship in the room and the support. I think that therapy is going to prove to be necessary for positive therapeutic processes, especially with PTSD and MDMA, because it's so relationally oriented. So I think the problems need to be faced head on and addressed, and people that are arguing for, not having therapy present, it's kind of like wishing some of the challenges to go away, and some of the pharmaceutical industry wishes that the therapist would go away so that they can just sell the medicine and move on with it. And so that's my 2 cents. In terms of what should be adjusted, I think we do need deep conversations about these misconduct issues and how to prevent it, how to make sure we're preparing people well in training, and then having systems of accountability that really address misconduct when it happens. And then we're all concerned with safety, and we could get into that whole conversation about commodification and corporate interests, but that's another Chacruna Forum that you can look up online, and we don't have time for that today.
I think it would be a travesty if we pulled experience out of this process. All the data now points to mystical experience is driving durable change, not the intensity of the psychedelic experience. And I think this would be a last gasp by the psychopharm paradigm to keep us locked into a paradigm that's devoid of soul, spirit connection, and the psyche. So I would see it as a huge travesty.
I'll say a controversial view maybe here amongst this group, which is if we can take the psychedelic experience out of psychedelics and we can show the same effects, I'm all for it. I am highly skeptical that can happen. I mean, again, the data would have to prove that to be true. And I do think that it's somewhat fantastical. But again, if we had some medication that worked as well as MDMA and didn't require therapy and didn't require any kind of subjective alteration, that it's sort of, we're talking, I think, sort of like a miracle cure. And again, I'm just highly skeptical that will work. But the other thing I'll say is, even if people have these sudden changes in terms of, particularly related to PTSD or other psychopathology, they still need help. They need a lot of help with the changes that come with that kind of drastic change. So I think therapy will always play a really important role there. And I think just to say, I don't want to end on this note, but I guess to say one of my concerns that people might be drawing conclusions from the advisory committee, which I think was, I guess I'll put it this way, I wouldn't draw conclusions on how to run psychedelic clinical trials based off of the AdCom committee's reaction to it. some industry groups are, which I think is just wait for the FDA and hear what the FDA has to say. And I think it is a great misfortune to be doing psychedelic research with psychedelics, actual psychedelics with psychedelic effects, and not give sufficient amount of support to Jamie's point.
I want to thank you each so much for being here, so much for having me a part of this discussion. You all are fascinating. Lesia, can you go ahead and come back on now and close us out?
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you for having us. Oops, we can't hear you, Lucia.
Hi. Okay, so thank you so much, Stephanie, Scott, Ingmar, Jamie, and thank you so much for the audience participation. And if you appreciate the work we do at Chacruna and would like to help, you can support us by becoming a Chacruna member through Patreon, which grants many benefits. And you can find more information on our social media and website. We would like to invite you all for our next community forum that will be next week on July 17th. And it's titled Judaism is Psychedelic, How Psychedelics Are Rekindling Jewish Practices and Healing. So see you soon in our next event. Thank you so much and bye. Thank you. See you soon.